Well, I've been talking a lot about what's going to happen on election day recently, but I need to step back and take a little bit of time to look at the bigger picture of what's going on right now. Because no matter who gets, no matter who wins in just over a week from now, things are not going to be great in the future. It's not like no matter who you support, whether electing Joe Biden's going to save the world or whether electing Donald Trump's going to save the world. Our fears, you can't put all your hopes and dreams, in the hands of these politicians, because they don't really affect you that much, not nearly as much as people think. And a great microcosm of that right now is the housing market. The housing market is absolutely insane. We're in the middle of a depression, and housing prices are marching higher and higher. I believe existing home sales just set a record. They set a record for the post-2008 recession era. We are now back to something akin to where sales were in 2006, at a time when we have very high unemployment. You have even the people who are still employed aren't making a whole lot of money. We have 7% of mortgages in forbearance, which means that people can't pay. 17% or so of FHA mortgages are in default. Or rather, default might not be the right term. They're delinquent. So 17.4% of people who have FHA mortgages are behind. And FHA is, if you're a lower income person, and by lower income I mean not a six-figure income, you probably are getting an FHA mortgage, unless you're a veteran or you're in a rural area, in which case it might make more sense to get a VA or a USDA loan. But again, these are all government mortgages with very favorable terms, and these are really the only kinds of loans that people who are not particularly rich or high income are able to get. And so to see that over 15% of those people are behind in their mortgage would make me think that, gee, aren't they going to be trying to sell their house? Isn't the lower end of the housing market, isn't it going to fall out? Why is it that prices can keep marching higher? That the median home price now is a record high of $311,000. It didn't get nearly that high back in the previous mania of '05 to '07. The top back then, the median home price was still like in the mid twos, maybe around 250. And the bottom in 2012 was around 150, so we've more than doubled since 2012. Does that make sense to anybody? And this number, again, keeps going up. I don't think it hit 300,000 until this year, and we're already at 311,000. And so I think this pretty clearly is not sustainable. I think that people generally agree on that, especially when you look at the reality. And again, I know this goes against Trump's talking points, but the whole K-shaped recovery thing, yeah, that's a real phenomenon. Poor people are not doing well right now. Of course, depending on where you live. And rich folks who have money in equities, who have money in stocks, who own a lot of real estate, they're doing very well right now. And that's why it makes sense, are able to buy a lot more on the high end of the market. Apparently, the high end of the real estate market is red hot in a lot of areas. And that, I would think would continue as long as the Fed is propping up the equity markets and increasing the wealth of the top 1%. That would make sense, but it does not make sense that the lower end of the housing market continues this march up. I think that we could have a K-shaped recovery in the housing market, or a K-shaped crash, to where the low end of the housing market completely plummets and the upper end just goes to the moon. Because no matter how good of an interest rate you give somebody, if we have higher credit standards, which the banks are raising their standards for who's getting a loan recently, if you're raising the standards and people just don't have jobs, they're not going to be able to get a loan to buy a house, even if you put it at an absurdly low interest rate and you make it so they can almost afford the payment. People just don't have the money to buy a $311,000 house. Where I live, to live in a relatively poor area, poor part of town, you're still looking at a $250,000 house. People who are poor, who are low income, they can't afford that. And rents, I mean, don't even try and rent a place. I mean, a studio apartment, it'll run you like $1,100-1,200. If you have kids, good luck finding a place under $2,000. And, and if you're someone who is a parent and you're making $30,000 to $40,000 a year, and you're spending, $24,000 of that a year just in rent, how does that make sense? And you can easily tack on another $2,000 a year just for your cable and your cell phone bill. Then you have food, then you have clothes, then you have your car insurance, probably a car payment because people are so heavily levered right now. Lots of people have car loans, which I think is a terrible financial decision. Never borrow money to buy a car, ever. Okay? Just don't do that. But a lot of people do it. People go down to these car dealers, and by the way, you're paying a pretty high interest rate. Folks have credit card debt. Americans are incredibly indebted right now. They are paying double-digit interest rates on their credit cards. It just doesn't add up to having a median home price of $311,000. This is not going to last. And the only reason why it's been propped up this far is because it's not that people are able, on the low end, are able to pay. Because the Fed stimulus and the Trump bucks, the $1,200, is helping them get by. That's not the case. These people can't afford to pay. It's that the federal government has come in and said, hey, if you've got a federally backed mortgage, you don't have to pay. You just go into forbearance and we'll let you kick the can down the road. But you have to pay later, we swear. And when do these people have to pay? When does forbearance end? Well, it's after the election, of course. So no matter who is going to win, unless they come in essentially and just forgive everyone's mortgage debt, there's no way that housing prices can stay where they are right now past the election. Early next year, forbearance is set to end in March. So folks who are benefiting from forbearance right now are going to have to start looking at putting their house on the market, because they're not going to be able to pay. Because it's not just you get forgiven all these payments that you weren't able to make in 2020. You have to make those payments up later. And so even if you don't have to pay it in one lump sum, let's say that your lender works out a deal to work that money into your monthly payment. Well, your monthly payment's going to go up to add in all the money that you didn't pay in 2020. And so again, you're going to have a lot of people who can't afford that. Our economy is not coming rearing back in a lot of places. A lot of places are still locked down, which is, it's hard for me to conceptualize that, since here in Florida we're lucky we have a governor who's reasonable, who didn't want to, become a tyrant. And so things have worked out pretty well here. But, no matter how you slice it, everywhere in the country, this is going to be a problem next year. And somebody, I guess what we could say is that, well, if no matter who gets in, Trump or Biden, the political pressure will be insane. I guess they'll just forgive everybody's mortgages. But I mean, what kind of precedent does that set? I mean, if that's the case, he'll go out right now and try and get a house, because who cares if I can pay for it or not if the mortgage is going to be forgiven? I mean, really, it's that bad. I don't see any other way out of this. Either housing prices have to come down, or people just don't have to pay. Or alternatively, the government introduces a kind of UBI program and just pays everyone's mortgage indirectly by mailing them checks every month for $2,000. But then you get into my whole problem with inflation. So I mean, that's the issue here. Either prices have to go down or they go up, but you can't keep things. And by go up, I mean go up inflation-wise in a very bad way, because it's just more money being thrown at everything in the economy. And that, I would hope everyone understands, is a very bad thing. You don't want that. Now, politically, this will be very interesting, because if Trump gets reelected, then all this stuff happens. He, of course, is going to be blamed. And a similar thing happened to Reagan in 1980, because they went into a recession very soon after when he was elected, and that would hurt his popularity. But the difference was, back then, Reagan knew that we had to take our medicine, and in order to end the stagflation of the 70s, we had to endure a recession, a very sharp recession, very painful recession. But he took his medicine, and by 1984, the economy was was doing better than it had when Reagan took office. Trump, if he had the stones, would do something similar. And he would make the country take its medicine early in 2021. Let us go into a deep, sharp recession, depression, and let us come out stronger on the other side. Now, is he going to do that? No. Donald Trump clearly doesn't want to do that. He would have done it in 2017 had he done that. And the way he talked in 2016, it sounded like he might have done that. Now, I didn't believe Trump back then, and so I have even less of a reason to believe him now that he has a record. And so I have to imagine that Trump is going to do the exact same thing that Biden would, and that's try to keep the game of musical chairs going for as long as possible, to try and keep propping up this market, which, you know, is a pretty sad thing for me as someone who would like to own a home at some point in my life. But it's not going to happen until long after all of this ridiculousness in the housing market comes to an end. I mean, pretty soon, the only people in the low end of the housing market, the only buyers are going to be institutional investors, you know, private equity firms and hedge funds and these sorts of folks who are buying them for rental properties because they yield more than a bond. You know, and all of us who are in the bottom, let's say 90% of income earners, you know, will just transition to being the tenants of Wall Street. And I know that sounds like a dystopian future, but again, I'm trying to go through all the possibilities of how you keep housing prices up. I don't see, you know, there's not a whole lot of scenarios. It's a pretty narrow path to keeping housing prices high. So with all that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.